One, we talked about, the road to Reconstruction going all the way back to the American Revolution, through the American Civil War, all the situation as it's set up by 1865. Then last week we um, talked about the problems that faced the nation at the beginning of Reconstruction. How do you bring back these 11 states that seceded from the United States, decided they wanted to be their own separate country, and then fought a bloody 4-year war to try to make that possible? The bloodiest war in American history, as we talked about, 750,000 people killed during all of that fighting. And as we talked about last week, the period that the United States begins working on that is called presidential reconstruction, because the president, Andrew Johnson here, is the only guy in charge. When Abraham Lincoln is assassinated in April 1865, Johnson, as vice president, becomes the new president, and he's the only guy in Washington, basically, with the authority to do any of this stuff that's going to be to answer any of the questions that Reconstruction is going to require that we answer. Because this Congress had gone in recess, you guys remember that, and Johnson is president and the only show in town. So between April and December of 1865, Johnson pretty much gets to write his own ticket and settle up his own policy. And as we talked about last time, he has to answer three main questions, right? What happens to the ex-Confederates? What happens to the states that seceded? And what happens to the former slaves? And he answers this basically by letting the South write their own ticket back into the United States, right? He offers basically blanket amnesty to ex-Confederates. You can all just kind of come back like nothing happened. The states can come back if and when they write constitutions that ratify the 13th Amendment. That's the really only requirement besides repudiating Confederate debt. And then when it came to the former slaves, Johnson didn't set a policy on purpose, because he knew that if he empowered the ex-Confederates in places like Texas or Mississippi or Alabama or wherever, that those ex-Confederates would effectively make sure that the newly freed slaves would not have citizenship rights, which was important to Johnson. And I showed you guys that quote of his last time, where he said that, as far as he's concerned, the United States was a government for white people, and as far as he was concerned as president, it would remain a government for white people. So that's really his running charge, as he declared it himself, when he becomes president and when he establishes his Reconstruction policy. And so we talked about last time, when we're picking up the story today, is that ex-Confederates, this was everything they could have ever hoped for, right? This was a dream as far as they were concerned, because they can write most of their own ticket coming back in. And so they move as quickly as possible. And they write new constitutions. In Texas, you guys can see it here on the left, they write the Constitution of 1866, which really represented the perspective of ex-Confederates, right? And it said that African Americans had no rights whatsoever, and it restored ex-Confederates basically to the same levels of power they had before the war, right? People like this guy on the right, Warren Roberts, who had been the chair of the Secession Convention, later been a colonel in the Confederate Army. And so what had happened under presidential Reconstruction is that the ex-Confederates got right back into power, just like nothing had happened. And they start marching back into the United States with full authority, just like before. And they send people like Warren Roberts here to Congress, to the United States Congress, as a senator, right? And where we left off last time is that did not go well with the white North, who were the entire Congress at that time, because of the Civil War, was made up of white Northerners. And so they refused to accept these ex-Confederates coming back into power. And this outraged the North. And that had enormous consequences, right? And this is exactly where we left off last time. Because what happens is that the North in 1866 has congressional elections, and they overwhelmingly elect Republicans, and what are often called radical Republicans, who are on the far more extreme edge of the Republican Party, to Congress, and they have a 2/3 majority, which means that the Republican Congress in the United States, can pass any law they want. And even if the president vetoes it, they have enough votes to override any presidential veto. So this is how Congress reclaims power over Reconstruction. All right. And so when that happens, things shift dramatically in Reconstruction to this new Congressional Reconstruction period. Right. So the central question for this first section is, how did Republicans take over in Texas during the late 1860s? And what did they do once they got into political power? Right. So with the Republicans in charge in the United States Congress, taking over Reconstruction, one of the first things they do, and we talked about this briefly last time, is they pass the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which has a really boring name and a lot of different pieces we went through last time. But the main idea here that you want to convey to your students is that they send the South back to the drawing board. They send Texas back to the drawing board. They have to start completely over with Reconstruction. And now they have to do it under military occupation, right? The United States Army is now going to be in charge. The South is divided in 5 military districts, right? Texas is in the 5th military district. You can see over here on the left with Louisiana, all right? There's a U.S. Army general who's in charge of this whole area over here. And now Texans are going to have to write a new constitution, all right, under new rules. And what's interesting about this is that they're going to write this new constitution, but the people who are going to do that are not going to be mostly ex-Confederates, all right? The ex-Confederates are being disbarred from participating in political office, from voting in many cases. And there's a requirement that when Texas elects officials to go to this new constitutional convention, all right, that they have to include African-American males, but African Americans voting as a part of electing new officials. All right. So a lot of ex-Confederates cannot vote, and their former slaves now can vote. And so when the election happens to elect delegates to write this new constitution, Black voters, it's the first time ever African Americans were allowed to vote in Texas. And they did. They came out in large numbers. 82% of eligible Black voters went to the polls to cast their vote for who would go to this new constitutional convention. By contrast, very few eligible whites went to the polls. All right, only 31%, less than a third of all eligible whites voted. And that's really important, because what you can see here is that African Americans have a large voice in sending who goes to this constitutional convention. The former slaves are the ones who are getting to make a lot of these choices. Their former masters, I mean, a lot of them just can't vote at all, but even the smaller subset who can vote, a lot of them just don't turn out and go to the polls. They just kind of say whatever. They kind of throw their hands up as protest. But that doesn't work very well for them, because now this new Republican Party that has come to Texas, all right, is going to write a new constitution for Texas to bring Texas back into the United States, all right? So this is when the Republican Party comes to Texas for the very first time, right, in the late 1860s as a part of Congressional Reconstruction. And when they come, there's been a lot of mythology and a lot of misunderstanding about who the Republicans were when they got to Texas, right? So I want to break this down here for a second, all right? There's 3 main groups that make up the Republican coalition, if you want to call it that, that's going to be reconstructing Texas, all right? Group number 1, and one of the most famous of them, are what are called carpetbaggers, which they did not call themselves this. These are all the words that their enemies used. But a carpetbagger, as you guys know, is someone who moves down into a territory who's not from there. We get the name carpetbagger because a cheap piece of luggage back then would literally be carpet that you pulled up and tied up together to make a bag that you would come down. That's what this bag is right here, right? And this carpetbaggers were supposedly Northerners who moved south to places like Texas to take over the situation and kind of run roughshod over the ex-Confederates. You can see in this cartoon right here, like there's the South right here with carpetbagger literally perched on top of them, some Union soldiers helping to force it along as they're walking along the ground there. Then the the Union guy looks a lot like Ulysses S. Grant right there. Anyway, there were some Northerners who moved to Texas. Yes, some of them came as a part of the Freedmen's Bureau. Some of them came to help establish schools. Some helped establish some freedmen's banks. Others were former Union Army officers who moved south I want to emphasize there were not a lot of these people. There were not a lot of Northerners who moved to Texas during this time period. All right. So the idea of carpetbaggers coming down and forcing things on Texas is really a myth that doesn't hold up when you look at the numbers of people who had gone to Texas. There are some, but there aren't very many. All right. The largest group actually in the Republican Party in Texas that's coming into form in the late 1860s are Southern whites, Southern former Democrats in some cases, who joined the Republican Party, right? And these are often called scalawags by people who don't like them. And I wish we had a better term for them. I need to come up with one. But these are people who joined the Republican coalition. Some of these guys were former Unionists who never thought secession was a good idea and resisted. Other guys were just people who saw the writing on the wall and realized that there's a big change happening and they'd rather be on the winning team. But there's a large number of white Texans who joined this Republican Party. I don't want to say like huge number, but of the Republican Party, this is probably one of the biggest groups that there is. All right. So the first group are carpetbaggers. The second group are what are called scalawags. I wish we had a better name. And the third group, as a part of this Republican Party in Texas, are the free people. In many cases, formerly enslaved people, all right, who became a part of the Republican Party, who were in some cases elected to the state legislature, who were elected to be a part of writing this new Constitution. I stole this slide from Chastity. These are three representatives who are elected to the Constitutional Convention that is about to write a new constitution. These are people in Texas. George Ruby, there's actually a new biography about George Ruby. It's really good if anyone's interested in it. Matthew Gaines, who I'll talk about again later when we talk about Texas A&M being established. Walter Moses Burton here. These are men who were elected. And I want to emphasize, Matthew Gaines is a good example of this. Matthew Gaines was a formerly enslaved person who becomes a legislator. There's no better representation in my mind of the massive shift that Reconstruction embodies to go from being an enslaved person to being a legislator, writing now the new Constitution for your former master. I mean, just think about the incredible shift that represents, right? Now, this was a big moment of empowerment for African-American men in this case, but it also was something that was lampooned by white Americans, white Texans in particular. So you'll see a lot of cartoons from this era that try to say that this is a terrible idea because these formerly enslaved people have no abilities, no powers, no rights, no education to be able to do any of these things. And so you'll see these cartoons that try to lambast them from the time period. And it gives you a sense, I think, of how many white Texans viewed this change that was happening all around them, something that was terrifying to them. So that Republican coalition comes together in Austin, Texas, formerly enslaved people, carpetbaggers, and then some white Texans who joined the Republican Party. And they write a new constitution for Texas. It's often called the Constitution of 1869, because that's when they got done with it. And the Constitution of 1869 represented the perspective of this Republican coalition. All right. Remember the Constitution of 1866 that we talked about last week, that represented the ex-Confederate perspective. This Constitution represents how the Republicans in Texas thought about things and what their priorities were. So this Constitution is a very simple Constitution, and it only has two main things that we're going to talk about. The first thing that it did is that it gave full citizenship rights to African Americans, right? So, ratifying the 13th, but embracing the 14th Amendment. And so it's the opposite of the 1866 Constitution. The 1866 Constitution had its version of the Black Code that said African Americans can't go to school, can't hold public office, can't testify in court, can't do any of those sorts of things. This says the opposite. They have all the rights of citizenship, up and down, left and right, every which direction you go. Okay? So that's step one. Step two is that the Constitution of 1869 centralized, that means concentrated, of course, government power in Austin, Texas. And it did particularly in the office of the governor. So the question is, why? Why would they do that? What was the purpose behind it? I'm actually going to pause for a second. Why don't y'all throw in the chat real fast for me ideas you have for why they would want to centralize? Why would that be a big point for the Republicans to centralize power in Austin, Texas, and particularly in the office of the governor? Why would they want to do that? You can control the governor, you have more control, keep power away from the former slaveholders. Local governments are not necessarily controllable. Simplicity. Not quite, but I like that. Control. Yeah. But why would they need control? Like, that's the open question, right? What are they trying to control so much? Too many rogue people. Well, yeah, some ex-Confederates who are going to be maybe problematic. Just went through a war, secession. Well, you guys are definitely on the right path with a lot of these different pieces. But think about this. Look at number 1 here on the screen. If you're going to give full citizenship rights to African Americans, that's great on paper. But if you're going to actually enforce that in county by county throughout Texas, all right, what are you going to need? Authority to be able to do that. And so what the Republicans are anticipating is a lot of resistance by the ex-Confederates. And so what they're doing by centralizing authority in Austin, Texas, is that they're trying to give themselves enough power to be able to actually force through some changes in how Texas operates, especially when it comes to the rights of African Americans who are now being given the ability to hold public office, testify in court, all those sorts of things, right? They're just recognizing the reality that they're going to get an enormous amount of resistance to that. They've got to do something about it. Let me back up for a second. Just to set the scene here, this is going to freak out ex-Confederates, right? This looks terrifying to them. This looks like the nightmare of what they don't want to happen. And it seems to be coming true right in front of them, right? Then at the same time, almost the same time, the US Congress back in Washington passes the 15th Amendment, right? And you guys know, 13th Amendment ends slavery. 14th Amendment does a lot of things, but the main thing is it defines citizenship and defines African Americans as being eligible for citizenship. The 15th Amendment here, all right, is about voting rights. And, you know, this manuscript copy is really fun, but I typed it up so you guys can actually read it with me. But what the 15th Amendment says is that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? Now, I'll show that to my students and I'll ask them, what does that mean? And they'll say, well, it means Black people get to vote. And I say, yeah, that's mostly right. All right, it means Black men get to vote. This is before the 19th Amendment. But what it also says, it doesn't say anyone has the right, guaranteed right to vote. It just says you can't keep someone from voting because of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. All right, I want to point that out because there's a giant loophole right there that's going to play out later in the Jim Crow era, because it doesn't say you can't deny people the right to vote for other reasons, like they didn't pay their poll tax or they didn't pass a literacy test. It's going to leave a big gaping hole there that's going to be exploited later. But what's the purpose here? The purpose is simple: to make sure that African American men can vote. And that's kind of an open question of why would the white North be so interested in making that happen? Why would Republicans in the United States Congress want to make sure that this would happen? And if you guys would think back to our first day, when I was talking about the road to Reconstruction, one of the things I pointed out is that, yes, the white South is racist during this period, but white Northerners were also not very much in favor of giving African Americans rights. They were not usually interested in the rights of African Americans. So why would white Northerners be interested in giving Black men in the South the right to vote? Well, there's a very practical reason for this. Republicans in the North realized that if they're going to be a successful party moving forward, they're going to need to get votes in the South, because eventually the Southern states are going to come back into the Union. And if they empower African Americans in the South to vote, who are those African Americans most likely going to vote for? the Republican Party. And so for white Northerners, it was a very it was a very pragmatic thing to give Black men the right to vote in the South, because then they would likely vote for the Republican Party, and they'll probably stay in the South, so that the white Northerners are going to get the benefit of that political machination. So they passed this, and then they asked Southern states to ratify it. And as you can imagine, this is going to also terrify and upset ex-Confederates, while at the same time empowering African-American males in the South in a way that they haven't been before. So I want to emphasize this to you, and I recommend pausing with this with your students for a moment, because the amount of change that's happened here in such a short period of time is just astronomical and kind of mind-spinning. Because on the right here, the screen right here, you see a former enslaved person who has gone from being owned as property to not only being free, but being a free citizen who can vote. And if you're Matthew Gaines, for example, might have been elected to the state legislature. Or some African Americans in other states were actually elected to the national legislature, right? That's amazing. On the left, you have his former master, who no longer can vote, lost the war, has lost everything financially probably, and now has no voice in the political system, right? A massive shift and a great contrast. And the guy on the left here is mad. But here's the thing. He can't do anything about it, not really. He cannot vote, so he doesn't have a voice in this larger system. So what do ex-Confederates do when they're shut out of the political system and have no direction to go to voice their anger and frustration? They form the Klan. They put on bed sheets over their heads, right? And I want to emphasize to you guys, the Klan, we usually think of the Klan as this very organized machine, and it will be later, especially in the 1920s. But in this period, it's just a loose group of guys in a lot of different places who come together. They have different names. There's the Klan, but there's the Knights of the White Chameleon and all kinds of groups. Basically, it's just angry ex-Confederates who are mad about what's happening and they can't vote. So they're going to use violence and terrorism to try to drive the Republicans out. All right, they'll use this violence against African Americans, but they'll also use it against whites who vote for the Republican Party. All right, they're trying to drive out the Republicans in southern places like Texas. And here's an actual image of one of these guys dressed up in his bed sheets, sitting on the back of his horse. And I always show this to my students, and every time somebody always points out to that horse, and like, the horse has an expression on his face like, this is so stupid. Why is this on my head? Why are we doing this? But this was a real terrifying thing that went on through places like Texas, as this violence was directed against African Americans, but also scalawags, as they were called, carpetbaggers, always trying to push out these different groups. Then at the same time that's happening, the Freedmen's Bureau ends in 1868. And we talked about the Freedmen's Bureau last week, but the Freedmen's Bureau is that agency that's job is to help the formerly enslaved people make the transition to freedom. They no longer are in operation because the federal government is no longer going to pay for them after 1868. So this resource that could have helped protect African Americans in some cases, or at least help them do something about Klan violence, goes away at almost this exact same moment, right? So you can see the Republicans are rising in power. The first Republican governor of Texas, Edmund J. Davis, is in charge of this great shift that's happening. But it's happening at the same time you also have this rising violence of ex-Confederates that are pushing against all of that. And that makes for a real combustible situation that we're going to pick up here again in a second. But I'm going to pause here at this moment and then hand the baton over to my colleagues. I think Chastity is going to walk you guys through some resources, and then we'll pick up the story from there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. So Michelle has put the link in the chat, and she's going to share screen for me because last week I had technical difficulties. I'm very disabled with technology when I only have one screen, so I don't want to mess it up this week. Thanks, Todd, for affirming me. So I took part one and provided you all some resources. I'll tell you, this content has so many um, hidden gems and angles you can go about it. And so one of the things I started with was not necessarily a hook. It could be a hook if you're super interesting as a teacher, but it's more of a pre-assessment. I think when teaching this, it is a good idea to kind of pause in between presidential and congressional reconstruction, because it's really important for students to kind of see the comparison between the two and just how different these time periods are. So what I've created is somewhat of like a curated KWL chart where we want to get students before we kind of launch into congressional to kind of tell us what do they know, what do they want to know, and then what did they learn. So this is a pre-assessment, but it can also be revisited as they learn. It can also just be a note-taking tool as you're going through congressional reconstruction, right? So it's not just a typical KWL laundry list. It's actually compartmentalized to get students to think about Texas during Reconstruction economically, socially, and politically. Again, you can't talk about these. You can't. All of these facets are intertwined, right? And so hopefully get them a chance to kind of go through, jog their memories from from presidential Reconstruction in order to lead them into congressional, and then they can revisit it. So that was the first thing that I dropped in there for you all. This time period is like heaven if you love political cartoons. There are so many political cartoons and images. So I really kind of framed the other two resources on that. In session one, someone mentioned, are we going to get some Texas examples in this workshop? And Joshua Houston was mentioned. Thank you so much to whoever mentioned that. Oh, is the picture not showing up? There we go. Because I literally went down a 2-week long rabbit hole studying Joshua Houston. How fascinating. And so I couldn't help myself but to give you all something to talk about Joshua Houston. Joshua Houston isn't explicitly named in the text, but boy, oh boy, does he give an opportunity to truly study what the life and the prospects of prosperity for an African American man and enslaved person was at the time. But also, more importantly, we're going to touch upon this next week when we talk about the legacies. It's really important for students to understand that the African American experience during slavery and post-slavery was not monolithic, right? You can't just kind of put a label and this is what all Black people experienced. And so Joshua Houston actually is mind blowing when you study him. So for those of you who don't know, Joshua Houston was the an enslaved man for Sam Houston, right? And he was introduced to Sam Houston through Sam Houston's wife. He actually was property of Sam Houston's wife and sort of came along with the family when they got married. And so the first activity that I have, which is really kind of a hook, is the portrait that you see up at the top. It's actually a portrait of Joshua Houston's family at his son's wedding. And I'm using a strategy that I really use a lot with students. It's called I See, I Know, I Wonder. And so for this activity, you would project the photo and have students really do a close analysis to tell you, like, what is the obvious? Don't make any inferences, but what do you see? And then do you know anything based on both the image and on the caption? And then what do you wonder? When I did this activity, I modeled it on myself. I mean, it's obvious that we see a large family unit, right? And so, that makes me wonder, like, was this wasn't the standard, because we know that many Black families were broken apart. So how did they stay a family, right? Also, look at the way that they're dressed, right? We see that they're dressed in like fine garments. What might we know? What might we wonder? So someone mentioned in the chat, it's really hard to get students kind of get out of the Black and white. I agree, but this strategy, if you do it kind of over time, really starts to force them, especially when I say like no inferences, because they start to try to make inferences. And so one thing that really helps is we do one column at a time. So I'll give like a minute and a half, 90 seconds. What do you see? And I often interject when I feel like they're going into an inference. I want to know, what do you see? Then what do you know? And then the wonderings. And the wonderings column is what we kind of use as a informal note-taking device where they could go back and clarify their wonderings. So that's the sort of intro into Joshua Houston. If we scroll down, I wanted to kind of give some more content and background. Our conversion is kind of off. We'll go back and fix that. Some context and background on Joshua Houston. So I found a fascinating resource that I linked to in the lesson plan. Looks like our conversion, it kind of got wonky when we moved it over into the drive. I'll make sure that it's in there. But essentially it is snippets from a book written about Joshua Houston. It includes narratives, firsthand accounts in this book. And I put the credits to the book in the lesson plan and a link to where you can access it on the Texas portal. And so I gave you the prologue of the book, which has a firsthand account of another gentleman who's enslaved alongside Joshua Houston, pretty much recounting the narrative of when Sam Houston passed away. Joshua Houston essentially donated $2,000 in gold to Sam Houston's widow. And it kind of talks about the backstory about the why. I also included the first page of 2 subsequent chapters of that book. So that way students can really gain a good understanding of who Joshua Houston was. And so I'm not sure what happened. We'll make sure that we fix this tonight. Make sure the pictures didn't come through. I don't really like giving you all, oh, here we go, PDF, but this is the screenshots of those snippets from the book with some analysis questions, particularly what do you know about Joshua Houston? What can you tell about his character? What was his relationship with Sam Houston like? And then really getting them to go back and clarify the wonderings up above, because his experience is fascinating and it's nothing like what a student would assume just based on having learned about slavery and the lives of enslaved people. His experience was quite different. Joshua Houston also gives a great opportunity to study what did African Americans do when they got into power, because we know that Joshua Houston, based off of this book and his narrative, he went on to sit on a board at a church. He also started a school, and we know that he was not only an alderman in his city, but he was a county commissioner, and he was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. So you can start to see, like, what did African Americans do by and large. So thank you to Miss Charlotte, I believe, who suggested Joshua Houston, because I think it's a fascinating look into the life of freed people of color and the decisions and the choices that they made after emancipation. The next resource for the political cartoon enthusiasts in the group is a political cartoon on the carpetbagger. It also includes lyrics to a song. So this essentially was kind of like the equivalent of an album cover back in the day for a song called The Carpetbagger, which has a lot of satire in it. And so we have the Carpetbagger cartoon, but then there's also the lyrics to the song, which I think we often don't really get our students analyzing period music enough. And so I wanted to include this as well. To accompany it, there is a political cartoon analysis document that there's a PDF to in the lesson plan with a link to it. It's here we go, perfect. Thank you, Michelle. You're right on time. And so it's just a simple political cartoon analysis tool that can be used, whether it's with this one or with others. And so I think it's a good opportunity to get kids looking at the satire and kind of have this inflated viewpoint of what people were saying about carpetbaggers. But also the lyrics to the song really kind of shed light on the satire, the satirical nature that people had these really over exaggerated views on carpetbaggers were coming down to take everything and sweep up the South, right? I did put an asterisk in the lesson plan. I know my son and my daughter experienced this for Christmas when we were singing Christmas carols, but there's a word that we don't use in the same context, and it's the chorus of the song, and it's repeated a whole bunch of times. And so I did put a note on the lesson plan. If you're teaching middle school students, like, you have to spoil the joke for them before you give them the lyrics of the song, because otherwise your whole lesson will get off track if you say the word. Michelle, you can scan over it, because if I say it, my kids are outside my door, they'll come in and it'll send me down the, squirrels. And so just be mindful of that. I included a lot of what I call lanya, which is extra, because I could have built this out into be like a week-long lesson for you guys, because it's fascinating. So I did give you the Texas portal, where you can find the narrative From Slave to Statesman, the legacy of Joshua Houston, in there. I suggest everybody do a good read on it. There's so many bits and pieces you can pull out of it and use in any context, really, for this time period. I put the carpetbagger in case you wanted to modify it, because it is a JPEG. When we talk about this sort of Congressional Reconstruction violence, last week I gave an example, which is the Jaybird Woodpecker War, which is a local example here for me in Fort Bend. And so I did put a link to an article on that online. One thing that I would encourage you to do is, this wasn't like an anomaly here in Fort Bend. These sort of little scuffles and coups took place across Texas. So, a quick search would help you to find out if these things sort of occurred, but also maybe having your students do some sort of investigation of who the legislators were during this time period, right? Who were they? What are their characteristics, demographics? What did they run on? What party were they? And then fast forward a few years and see how that whole table turned, which Andrew's going to go into next. And so I did include a little bit about the Jaybird Woodpecker War, which again is a classic case of the Democrats at the time were the Jaybirds, and the quote unquote scalawags were the woodpeckers. And the woodpeckers won an election, and there was a scuffle, and which led on to a full war where the governor actually had to come down. Ultimately, the Jaybirds won that war and ran the woodpeckers and a large percentage of the Black population out of that particular part of Fort Bend. And they essentially changed laws and wrote legislation that would limit Black enfranchisement in Fort Bend County for about 70 years. So if you want an example of that time period. And then if we move the mouse real quick, sorry, I know I put a lot of stuff in here for you guys. The last one, I actually found it this morning, because again, I was trying to give you as much as I can. And it is an article in Texas Highways. It's the online magazine. I'm actually going to, Michelle, if I'm going to share my screen, because I want to show how great the illustrations are. There we go. And so I just found this. It is actually, it covers the Black senators during after the Civil War. And the illustrations are really, really like high quality by Cynthia Asaseri. And so essentially you could take this article and print it out and turn it into placards or snippets. It talks about these three gentlemen. And I actually used this piece today when I spoke to a group of fifth graders about local Fort Bend Black history, because he is from Fort Bend County. He was the first elected Black sheriff nationally. And we didn't have another Black sheriff until I believe 2018 with our current sheriff, Eric Fagan. And so I just thought the article was clear and concise, and the illustrations are great and high impact. So I wanted to share that with you. I know I probably went over my time, but I get excited about this time period. I can talk about it all day.
You don't have to apologize for bringing all those great resources. Thank you, Chastity. There's just so much good stuff there. I was actually watching the chat, and a lot of the questions that came up I thought were really interesting and useful, talking about like how we use multimedia in different ways, how we get students to think past simple black-white dynamics and to really dive into the people in these questions, which I think are really good. I'd like to talk about that Q&A afterward if we get a chance. But as you just said, Chastity, there's just so much stuff. I know you guys don't have a lot of time to go through Reconstruction, but there's just such a richness here. And I wish this was more celebrated in the TEKS, because this is such a crucial period of transition in all kinds of ways. And so to pick the story back up, let's see here. Things are going to go a little sideways in Texas going forward from here. As we said, we've got these kind of two tracks going on here. The Republicans are trying to build something, and the ex-Confederates are reacting to it, right? So as we move forward, the essential question for this second section is, because this is going to be a period when ex-Confederates are going to reclaim power. So how were ex-Confederates finally able to reclaim power in Texas? How did they climb back up? Because they will. And then what did they decide to do once they were back in power, right? That's the driving question. So Edmund J. Davis, again, he's the Republican governor, first Republican governor of Texas. And so he's helping this Republican coalition that's coming in the state try to give African Americans the rights they had deserved as citizens and enforce them by putting power in Austin, Texas. And so they do this a couple of ways. One of the first things they do, that Davis does, is they establish something called the state police, which is not the Texas Rangers, but it is a statewide police force. And it's basically I wouldn't say the private, but it's a state police force that was at the direction of the governor and the state's Republican Party. So basically, the Republican Party give themselves their own law enforcement agency, because they know the county sheriff in you pick the county is not going to necessarily listen to what they have to say. So they establish this police force. And one of the first things this police force has to do is start running down ex-Confederates who are a part of this new Ku Klux Klan activity in the state. All right, so they start cracking down on Klansmen and ex-Confederates throughout the state. And one of the things I find so interesting about this is that 40% of the state police were made up of African Americans. So former slaves, in the most cases, are now in the state police force, who are being sent by the governor, the Republican governor, to chase down, in many cases, their ex-masters who are part of this Klan activity of angry ex-Confederates. Again, it's part of that big shift that's happening all across the state. But something else that the Republicans invested in is something I know is near and dear to everyone's heart in this particular Zoom call, is public education. And this came up in an earlier session, Mirabeau Lamar and discussions about his role in education. But the reality was that there really was no state education system in Texas before Reconstruction. And it is the Republicans who established that in the late 1860s, early 1870s, because they want to invest in public education. It's good for them, but it's also good for the ex-slaves, the new free people who had been, up until now, it was illegal to teach them to read or write and have any access to education. Now that's going to change, but it's not just going to be for African Americans. It's going to be for everybody in Texas. And so there's a public education system that's established at the state. One of the things I like to talk about that is that the image you guys see up on the screen, that's the early Texas A&M University right there. All right. And I actually went to A&M as an undergrad, so this is near and dear to me. And the money that was set aside to establish A&M was set aside in part by Matthew Gaines. All right. There's now a statue to Matthew Gaines on A&M's campus. It took a long time to get one, but it's there now. And is a part of this Republican coalition trying to establish public education in the state of Texas. But it's not just universities. The main part of it is what we call K through 12 today. And these were open to Anglo-American kids, African-American kids, Mexican-American kids. It was open to pretty much everybody. And you can see by the early 1870s, there's more than 125,000 students enrolled in Texas public schools. That's a massive shift. that had not happened before, that did not exist before, that is being created out of whole cloth by the Republicans in the state legislature. In some cases, like with Matthew Gaines, by former enslaved people in the state who are leading the charge on this. But if you're going to have things like the state police, if you're going to have things like public education, which you guys all know is not free, it's got to get paid for. You got to pay for school buildings, you got to pay for teachers. Question is, how do you pay for all of that at a statewide level? All right. And the answer is, at this time, taxes, right? It's true then, it's true now. We pay through most of this stuff through taxes. And that's one thing that the Republican Party also did in Texas, is that they raised taxes in large measure across the board for almost all Texans, white Texans, Black Texans, Mexican-American Texans. They're all having to deal now with increased taxes to pay for all of this, right? And to give you a sense of just how big a shift this was and how much of a steep climb all these taxes produced, I want to show you guys can see on the screen here, this tax bill, right, for a couple in Harrison County, Texas. And you can see, I'll walk through this with you, but at the end of the Civil War in 1865, they owned a little more than $11,000 in property. And so their tax bill was about $30, right? Then in 1872, all right, they owned a little more property. They owned about $17,000 in property, but their tax bill had gone up to $362. So the value of their property increased by 57%, but their tax bill went up 1,138%. So you can imagine the reaction you would get if your tax bill went up over 1,100%, right? That's going to produce a lot of angst and anger. And again, if you're an ex-Confederate, how are you feeling? You're feeling like all this is just topsy-turvy. Your former slaves have been put as legislators. These carpetbaggers have come down. They've taken over the government from you. They won't let you vote. And now they're jacking your taxes up into the roof so they can educate Black kids and Mexican-American kids with these new public schools, right? This would make you furious if you're one of these ex-Confederates, right? And so this political cartoon, I love that Chastity showed so many really cool cartoons, because she's right. This is an era where you have so much rich visual that you can use, both of actual pictures of people in some cases, but also the cartoons in particular. And this, I use this with my students all the time. You've got an African-American on the left here with in his hand, he's got a vote, and you've got an ex-Confederate on the right, and on the ground you can see no vote torn up there on the bottom. And this sort of encapsulates who's got power, who doesn't. This is obviously from the perspective of an ex-Confederate here, but it gives you a sense of this angst that they're feeling at everything that's happening, right? And they expressed a lot of that angst through the Ku Klux Klan. But by the early 1870s, the federal government had been clamping down on the Klan. There was a federal act called the Ku Klux Klan Act that had been passed by the Ulysses S. Grant administration in Washington, D.C., that was used to stamp down on the Klan and use federal authority to bring them to justice. And so that really quashed most of the Klan activity. The Klan will live on in own little ways, and it really flourished in the 1920s. But it gets shoved aside, which is to say that ex-Confederates have to find a different way. That's what they decide. They've got to find some other way to deal with all these problems, because using violence and terrorism isn't working as well as they necessarily had hoped. Adding fuel to that fire is the fact that in 1873, there's a massive depression that hits the United States. And we've had a lot of these, but the Depression of 1873 is a massive, massive depression that we usually don't ever talk about, but it's worth pointing out to our students that the economy just went in the tank in a really big and powerful way. I get one basic statistic here I was going to share with you guys. There's a whole raft of things, but by 1876, 3 years into the Depression, about 18,000 businesses that had failed, and unemployment in the United States goes up to 15%, right? That will only be exceeded by the Depression of 1893, and then of course the Great Depression, which gets it all the way up to 25%. But think of it this way: this is the third worst depression that has ever happened in American history, right? It's happening in the middle of all of this, and that's really going to matter at this moment, okay? Because by the time you get to 1873, 1874, 1875, when this depression is just destroying the national economy, something important shifts in the North, which is that white Northerners are kind of tired of Reconstruction, tired of paying for Reconstruction, and really tired of fighting the white South on pretty much everything. And so it's at this moment that the will to keep going in the North starts dissipating amongst white Northerners. And so by the mid 1870s, Northerners have really started kind of backing off a little bit from the struggles of Reconstruction for all the reasons I just mentioned. They had been fighting the South basically since 1861. So by the time you get to 1876, it's been going on for 15 years. That's a long time to be locking horns with anybody. And it's been an exhausting experience, right? And then as part of that, particularly in the aftermath of the Depression of 1873, Northerners were tired of paying for the military occupation of the South and everything that came with it. That's one of the reasons that the Freedmen's Bureau had been discontinued in 1868. So, they're tired of it. They're also tired of paying for it. And then, truthfully, a lot of white Northerners had lost interest in making their own sacrifices on behalf of freed people in the South. The 15th Amendment and empowering African-American voting in the South was a real incentive for Republicans when they knew they're going to get votes in the South, but continuing to fight on behalf of the rights of African-Americans was not something that a lot of white Northerners were willing to continue, especially when it's costing so much money, especially when it's going on for so long. So I say all that to say that by the early to mid 1870s, white Northerners are kind of backing off from stuff. And white Southerners, ex-Confederates in places like Texas, are now going to push as hard as they can to push those Republicans out of places like Texas, right? And so here's another cartoon from the period that tries to make that argument very, very clearly, saying the Democratic Party over here on the left was the party for white people, and that the Republican Party was just for the rights of African Americans. And so they're trying to drive a wedge between the Republican Party and any voting support they could have amongst white people in places like Texas. And so ex-Confederates start getting registered to vote. And that's how they're going to reclaim power. How are the ex-Confederates going to get back into power? They're going to go back to the voting booth. But the way to do that is that they have to take something called the ironclad oath, where they hold up their hand and say, I swear allegiance to the United States and that I never fought against it, and I love the United States forever, and I'll never betray it again. That was too much for some ex-Confederates, especially those who had lost a loved one or lost a limb in the Civil War. But for a lot of other ex-Confederates, they'd reached the point of, we got to do something. So they start pushing to get registered to vote. Enough of them get registered to vote that by 1873, when the Depression hits, they elected this guy, the guy who's on the screen right now, a guy named Richard Koch, who was himself an ex-Confederate. He was elected as governor of Texas, and he's a Democrat, he's an ex-Confederate, and he's going to replace Governor Davis as the governor of Texas. So the ex-Confederates reclaim the governorship. And this is part of what they called redeeming Texas. So this period is often called redemption. That's the name the ex-Confederates used to say they were reclaiming, redeeming places like Texas from the Republican Party. So they get Richard Koch elected. That's all grand and dandy. Then they get even more representatives elected at lots of different levels. And what they ultimately do is by 1875, they have enough people elected, enough ex-Confederates elected, that they call a constitutional convention in Austin, Texas, to write a new constitution for Texas, which this has my students' heads spinning, because at this point, it's our third constitution. And they're just like, how many are there going to be? I'll say, this is the last one. This is what they're going to write, as it turns out, will be the constitution we have for the state up until today. All right. So the Redeemers, as they call themselves, ex-Confederates, they call this constitutional convention. These are the guys right here, right? And they write a new constitution. The Constitution of 1876, often called the Redeemer Constitution. You could call it our modern state constitution with a lot of amendments, but they write this new constitution. And again, this new constitution will represent the perspectives of ex-Confederates, like they did in 1866. The difference, though, is that in Constitution of 1866, they didn't have to deal with the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship rights to African Americans. They didn't have to deal with the 15th Amendment, which gave African American males the right to vote. They want the same thing in 1876. They want to restore ex-Confederates to power, but now they've got to do it and try to get around the 13th, or really the 14th and the 15th Amendments. So how are they going to do it? They're going to write a constitution that will basically strip power out of Austin, Texas. All right. The first thing they did is they made the governor a very, very weak position. He was appointed only to a 2-year term rather than a 4-year term. And the governor would have virtually no control over any other state official whatsoever. Then they said that the state legislature could only meet every other year rather than every year, which is why the Texas legislature does that up until this very day. They reduced the power of state judges and courts. They pushed for the elimination of the state to spend money or incur any debt. Basically, if it can't spend money, it can't do anything, is the idea. And then, well, all of this, they said public schools could not be supported by the state of Texas. Just saying, across the board, we're not going to put any money into public education the way that the Republican Party had done. All right. Why? Why are they doing this? Why is this their approach? What does this all have in common? They're stripping power out of Austin, Texas, out of the state government, the opposite of what the Republicans have done. Why are they doing that? Very basic. They're trying to take power away from the state government. And if it's not going to be in the state government, where's power going to go? To the county level. It's going to go to all the local jurisdictions, all the local county sheriffs. And if you take power out of the state government and put it down at the local level, all right, who's going to be in charge? All the ex-Confederates in these local places, all the county sheriffs that are in charge in these little places. And that, they hope, will mean that the rights of African Americans that are enshrined in the 14th and 15th Amendments that the state had been trying to defend would no longer be defended, right? The central idea you can see was to take power away from the state government and keep it local where it can be better managed and then used to subordinate African Americans. How do we know that was their intention? Because they said it. They said it loudly and proudly as often as they possibly could, right? So Reconstruction in Texas comes to a violent end in the mid-1870s as the state is reclaimed by the former Confederates, redeemed, as they said, by people like Oral Roberts, who will later become governor of the state after Texas has been redeemed. And you can see right here, African Americans now have legal rights on paper, but in practice, those will be stripped away as a consequence of the redemption of these ex-Confederates getting back into power, which you can see very much in this political cartoon right here, is this gentleman has the right to vote, but right to vote the way that they want him to vote, right? And African Americans will cope and will flourish in all kinds of ways in the late 19th and early 20th century. I don't want to downplay that. I don't want to ignore that. African American landowning continues to rise in Texas during this period. African Americans take advantage of educational opportunities for themselves and their families. There's a real powerful story in the late 19th and early 20th century of African American communities in Texas growing, flourishing, developing, building for each other, all kinds of amazing ways. So we don't want to forget about any of that. But at the same time, all right, we enter a period after Reconstruction with the redemption of Texas that is a very dark period for the legacy of the rights of African Americans in the state. And we'll talk about that in more detail next week. But when you get right down to it, we started this whole section on Reconstruction with the three big questions. What happens to the ex-Confederates? What happens to the states? And what happens to the former slaves? So in the end, what had happened? What are the answers to those three big questions? Well, first, no ex-Confederates were hung, and all were basically forgiven, even Jefferson Davis, which the US government was going to put him on trial. They were going to make a show of him, and then they eventually end up releasing him without putting him on trial. All the states were eventually allowed back in with full political power after having also ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution. So those are, and that's no small thing. That's a major change that Reconstruction makes possible, right? But it means that, again, as I said, on paper, the former slaves were given equal status before the law. But in practice, as we see, that will not be the case. All right. And as Chastity showed, I think biography is a really powerful way to do this and make this real for our students. Joshua Houston's story is really powerful. Austin had asked about getting kids to go past simple, black and white, yes or no kind of dichotomies. And how do we see these experiences through the eyes of real people? And I love telling stories that I think really illustrate this. So I'm going to tell you guys a quick story about a woman, African-American woman named Azaline Hearn, that I'm sure none of you have heard of. She has an amazing story. So has anybody heard of Hearn, Texas, which is just a little north of College Station? It's a great place to get a speeding ticket. I can tell you from personal experience. Not a very big town. It was established by the Hearn brothers, or it's named, I should say, for the Hearn brothers. And there was a bunch of these guys. There was a whole group of them that moved to Texas in the 1850s from Louisiana. There was a guy named Ebenezer Hearn. I love that name. There was a guy named Christopher Columbus Hearn. But one of the brothers was named Samuel Hearn. And Sam Hearn had a plantation. All these guys had cotton plantations around what is modern day Hearn. And Sam Hearn had a plantation that he was growing a lot of cotton, had a lot of enslaved people. He was a very wealthy man. And he had one enslaved woman on his plantation named Azaline. And this is not a picture of Azaline. I don't have a picture of her, but I want to use a picture as kind of as a stand-in. I think it humanizes the story a little bit. But Azaline was a slave of Sam Hearn's, and Sam Hearn had a sexual relationship with Azaline, which was not unusual for the era. A lot of planters had sex with their slaves. That was not uncommon. If you look in the census, the number of times mulatto shows up is a really good indicator of how often the color line was crossed. But we don't know much about that. What we do know is that there was an unusual circumstance because they had a child, also not unusual, but Sam Hearn recognized their child as his legitimate son. His name was Doc. And Doc grew up on the plantation, officially the property of his father. But when the Civil War was almost over, Sam Hearn named his son Doc as his heir, which is an amazing thing. And then Sam Hearn proceeded to die right after the Civil War. And when he died, the whole estate went to his son Doc, which is amazing by itself. But then Doc dies about a year later of yellow fever in Galveston, Texas. And when Doc died, the entire estate went to his next of kin, who was his mother. So Azaline Hearn inherits the plantation she was formerly a slave. All right, so just think about that one for a second. And it's a massive, powerful, very wealthy plantation. That is an amazing story all by itself. But here's the real kicker, and why this matters for Reconstruction, is that she has a plantation that is surrounded by the other Hearn brothers who don't like that this has happened. They don't like that their brother's plantation has been inherited by a former slave of his. And so the Hearn brothers proceed to try to take the plantation away from her. And this is why Reconstruction matters, because the resources that were available to her at certain times depended on who was in charge. So in 1866 and early 1867, the ex-Confederates in charge. And so they bring lawsuits against her, and the judges are ex-Confederates that the suit comes up in front of, and she has several judgments put against her. They're going to take her land. But right before they can take the land, Congress takes over Reconstruction. They put Texas under military rule, and now this new Republican Party moves in, and the new Republican government in Austin, Texas has shifted everything. The ex-Confederates aren't in power anymore. New judges are being established. And so when her case comes before the court again, now it's Republicans who are in charge, who are in support. And so she wins her cases, as she should have, like legally. If you go through the cases, like she has rock solid title to this land. And so she wins the cases. She's going to get to stay on her land. Things look good until 1873, when redemption begins. And when that happens, things start being pushed the other way one more time. Ex-Confederates start getting into power again. They start getting into the courts again. They start getting into judgeships again. And she has the entire estate taken from her illegally. Eventually, this gets up to the Texas Supreme Court, and the Texas Supreme Court, which is now stocked with ex-Confederates, issues a judgment against her solely based on the argument that she filed some of her paperwork a day late. That's what they hang the entire thing, because they know it's a farce. They know they're stealing from her. But by this point, with the ex-Confederates back in charge, that's what matters. And so she has the whole place taken from her. And we actually don't know what happens to her after that. She loses everything. She wanders the Brazos Bottoms over there, penniless. She dies alone. We know that. And she's buried somewhere. We don't know where it is, in an unmarked grave. And it's a really sad story, but it's a powerful one to demonstrate, I think, that these debates about constitutions and who was in charge and who wasn't really matter in a way that had a powerful effect in people's lived experiences. So, as Chastity said, all these things are interrelated. So when we talk about explaining the political, economic, and social effects of Reconstruction, you really can't separate them. You have to talk about them as relating all to one another, because the political affected the economic, in this case, affected the social in the story of Azaline Hart. So I'm going to pause there, and then I'm going to hand it over to Michelle, who Michelle's camera is not working, but as she showed, her ability to share her screen is, so she'll be able to walk you through all the great resources that she has available for you guys.
All right, thanks, Andrew, and hello, everybody. I apologize for my video not working, but actually I don't, because I'm a tired teacher on a Monday afternoon, so I think this is a little bit perfect for me. All right, and maybe it works for you guys as well. I'm just gonna dive into lesson 2. I have to stop and say, like, I love knowing all of the fabulous details of these stories that Andrew tells, because it gives us some perspective on just like the sheer bravery of these people. They're fabulous. I don't think I could put myself in their shoes and be equally as brave. As Andrew was saying, as he ended it, you really can't separate all of the different perspectives. It's really hard. And I will say this, as my 7th graders are coming into my classroom, and we start talking about the breakdown of laws and all the things associated with the Reconstruction era, they rarely know exactly what the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments are. They've been told them before. They don't know what they mean. And so there's one thing that I saw missing, a piece that I saw missing, and I wanted to give that to you guys. It's simply just a breakdown of the amendments. And what I've done is created like this comparison of the amendments versus the public opinion, which would be a political cartoon. And so these things are represented. I mean, we all know that political cartoons really make fun of all these situations, but students, my students can see what the amendment means a lot better if it's pictured with some of the things that are slandering it. So I'm not going to sit here and go through all of these, but I did want to show you that I've got a student document to go along with that. It's easy to print. I would say if you're going to use the slideshows for comparison, maybe present them to the whole class, or maybe if they have devices, you can do that on devices. This is just a very simple, chart for them to chart their findings, basically, right? The 13th Amendment, I just asked them to put a brief summary that includes the main idea or key details for each section. That's not too much work. And then just some simple questions that walk them through the political cartoon comparison. And then, of course, there's follow-up questions at the bottom. Does this political cartoon support or reject the amendment? And then I always ask my students, how do you know this? Like, sometimes they get caught up with like, show your evidence, or those are kind of big questions, but I always ask them, how do they know? And they're usually able to answer that in a little bit more simplistic way. And then moving on, my primary source document is all about Mr. Matthew Gaines, Senator Matthew Gaines, because, well, number one, because he's honored here in College Station, and the university has this fabulous fabulous big statue of him on campus now, and it's fairly new actually. They held the press conference a couple years ago. Anyways, I walk past it every time I'm there, and I think that his story is unique in the fact that he was incredibly bold. And so, what I have not done is provided you with a bio of his life. I did link that in the bottom of the lesson resources. But what I did find was this really wonderful newspaper article with his speech. It's a speech written that he delivered to the Senate in Texas, and it was in 1871. Here's the gist of this. He's really like standing up for all things right, and he's calling out all of these people that are totally like just rubbing the or not running the political parties into the ground, and he's tired of it. He's sick of it. And I want to point out a couple of things that he says in his speech. He's calling them slanderous. He's calling out the falsehoods, but he also says this. He says they abuse me and they may assassinate me. He literally says it out loud. I may be assassinated for this, but I don't care, because I'm not changing. I'm not going to change my vote. I'm not going to turn my back on my people. He knows why he's there, and he never ever loses focus. So this is just one of those like fabulous speeches that I couldn't look past. I shortened it up. There's way more. I put the link in here if you guys want the link. But I didn't like cut and paste the paper in here because the paper is really old and it will be hard for students to read. But if you want to see the paper, you can totally see it there. And then the questions are really just like this kind of profile of who Matthew Gaines is. It doesn't give a whole lot of insight about his background, but students can totally figure out his occupation, political party affiliation, which is Republican, by the way. And the other people that he's calling out are also they're also in the Republican Party with him. And so his ethnicity and race, that's a big deal because of who he is. So there's questions associated. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can read them yourself in a little bit. But I did want to point out at the very bottom that I linked his bio in here. It's from A&M. They have a great bio about him on their website. So you guys can totally use that backup information. And then continuing on to the exit ticket, I've got a couple of interactive maps. So before I open this up, I'm just going to say that this activity will require that students have like a one-to-one device, or maybe like they're sharing a device with an elbow partner or something if your district doesn't have that. But if they do, these are fabulous interactive maps. I found them from Oregon University. They have this whole slew, this whole database of maps. And so, and actually I linked the whole database in there, but I linked these specifically into the lesson plan. So the first one is all about the military districts in the South. It shows the division of them, and like obviously you can clearly see what's going on here, right? This is super easy to read, and it's also interactive. There's a little bit of information at the bottom for students, and I'm going to open up the student document as well, so you guys can take a glance at that. The student document itself has these links in at the very inside of each section. And also, I forgot about this part. The student document for the military district map has like a little brief segment from the Texas Republican, from the newspaper, just to let students know exactly, give them an idea of what military districts were and why they were set up, specifically for Texas. So all I would ask my students to do is classify these states. Who was in District 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. And then I also added the generals that were in charge of each district. And the next one is the duration of radical governments in the South. This is such a cool interactive map. if it will load, I will give you guys a look at this. Okay. So here's the interactive map. It starts at 1865. Johnsonian governments are all over the place, obviously. And then I think the next year I put on there is 1867. So Tennessee becomes a radical Republican government. Then they'll check out, I think, 1869 after that. There's a lot of change that happens. And then moving on, like you guys can see the change. It's clear, like it's crystal clear. All the things are changing until we get to 1867, and it's all conservative white governments. So I'm going to head back to the student document. So that the students are going to like make this chart, right? They're going to fill this out based on the information on those maps. And then after they make the chart, I want them to do something with it, right? So I'm going to ask them, what conclusions can you draw based on the evidence from this chart? And if you need to add some details on that to that question, you totally can. But I would say that like the conclusions are that we started out strong, right? We started out really strong with the division of the Johnsonian governments and then moved on to the radical Republican governments. You can see the clear change. And then all of a sudden, here we are back again with the conservative white governments in 1877. So it ends up right back where we started. That's the exit ticket, but you could use that for any kind of piece that you might want to use it for instead of an exit ticket. I do want to show you a couple of things on the other primary source materials link. I linked in that mapping history for the University of Oregon. They have fabulous information about cotton and like the growth of cotton and the spread of slavery all at the same time. I would highly recommend going in there and just like playing with all the eras and seeing what's available. And then in addition to that, I linked some videos in here because I remember last time when I told you guys about a video, the chat was lighting up, and I love using like 2 to 3 minute videos in my classroom to help teach because a lot of times like you have to be careful what you use, right? You have to check them out, make sure they're sound. But whenever you can provide a different voice and especially different pictures or experiences or just something different inside of the classroom, videos go a long way. So that is all I've got for you guys today. I'm going to hand it back to Andrew. Let's see, and stop sharing at the same time. Oh, there it is. Stop share.
Thank you, Michelle. I mean, I love doing this with you guys for so many reasons, but one of which is that between what Chastity and Michelle both shared, it's an enormous amount of resources, more than we can all use, but everybody comes at these things from different angles, different classroom experiences. And so what works for one person's classroom may not be for another, but all these things are infinitely adaptable in all kinds of beautiful ways. And the theme I saw is, and I said this in the chat just a second ago, is like visuals between political cartoons, mapping. I mean, that's something actually, it's been a theme throughout this entire series thus far that we're going to continue. But I love that Michelle ended with that reference to those maps that talk about these big, long shifts, because that's where we're going next week, is that we're going to be talking about the long-term legacies of Reconstruction. Because I think another mistake that we make with Reconstruction is that we end in 1876, 77, and pretend that that was just that. Now we're just moving on forever. But the long threads of all of this help explain so many later developments that are going to be really important. So next week, we're going to be talking about a lot of that. But right there, I wanted to pause real fast.